Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, for people out there who are entrepreneurs or business owners or perhaps leaders or managers of large corporations, it's time to take a look at how we're doing things to figure out how we can outthink, outsmart, and outmotivate our competition, that we can stay ahead of the game and be sure that we're leaders in our industry, even if it's a small convenience store. The question is how do you come to make those particular decisions that will help you do that? It's always amazing that when we have an outside pair of eyes, ears, and perhaps a way that we can touch certain things, that we discover those common sense answers that seem to reveal themselves right in front of us, but it's only when it comes from some other source. On the program today, we're going to be talking about a concept known as red teaming. It's a way your business can conquer the competition by challenging everything, which is what we should do if we're ever going to learn to grow, develop, and actually outclass the people that are in our industries to be able to do that very thing. The book is Red Teaming. It's how your business can conquer the competition by challenging everything. And our guest joining us here on the program today is Mr. Bryce Hoffman, who is a best-selling author, speaker, and consultant who helps companies around the world plan better and global leaders lead better by applying innovative systems from the worlds of business and the military. Bryce, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Now, you've been doing this for quite a long time, and obviously you've been doing this pretty much around the world, so you've been able to have a nice potpourri of ways that things work and innovative ideas. Tell you how you came to come up with this book, Red Teaming.
Sure, Daniel. You know, my last book, American Icon, told the story of how Alan Mulally saved Ford Motor Company, and in it I describe his management system, which he developed when he was the president of Boeing, then brought to Ford and used it to save not one, but two iconic American companies. And it's a great system, and it can change cultures, and it can help companies to become very successful. But one of the things that it can't do is be Alan Mulally. And what I mean by that is, what I learned as I started helping companies around the world implement Alan Mulally's management system is that as good as the system is, and it's very good, one of the magic ingredients is having a leader like Alan who has a contrarian mindset, who questions everything, who asks the very sort of questions, Daniel, that you raised in the introduction there. Is this the right way to do things? Is there better ways to do things? Why is the conventional wisdom true? Who says so? And so I began looking to see if there was a system that could help leaders, whether they're frontline managers, whether they're running global corporations, or as you said, whether they're running their own businesses, think like that. And I found it in this system, Red Teaming, that was developed by the military and intelligence agencies after 9/11 to deal with the failures of imagination that led to the terrorist attacks on this country, and the failures of imagination that led to some of the military blunders that the military itself, will be the first ones to tell you that we made in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. So responding to that, determined not to let those things happen again, they created this system to help organizations, to help leaders stress test their strategies, make better decisions, and also to kind of challenge the groupthink and the conventional wisdom and get at the real truth that is often exists laying down inside the organization, layers down.
Now, I'd like to start with, just recently I had watched a wonderful documentary about the rise of the personal computer. Now, a lot of people, when you say, when do you think the first PC actually appeared on, let's say desks at home, things like that, most people will probably say, well, that's Apple Computer, that's easy. But the fact is it was actually IBM, but they ended up becoming dominated by a little computer company that came along known as Compaq. And, there's an example of what we're talking about here with red teaming is, you have IBM, this huge dominant force in the world of computing, basically thinking they were invulnerable to anybody ever being able to take on it. Sort of like, there's Goliath out there running the landscape. But yet this company was able to not only do that, but they toppled IBM at the same time. Is that an example we can use here for red teaming and how they kind of thought, as we always hear, outside the box, but a fresh pair of eyes about what people are looking for and what they need and start challenging those kinds of assumptions, especially when it comes to a large organization like IBM?
You know, what you're talking about, Daniel, is really the sort of problem that red teaming is designed to tackle at large organizations. You know, let me tell you another story from the early days of the personal computer that I talk about in my book as an example of this, is Xerox. So most people in business have probably heard the story about, you know, how Xerox actually pioneered almost all of the elements of the Macintosh in their own computer well ahead of Apple creating it. They had a computer that had, you know, white screen with black text with WYSIWYG display, you know, that what you see is what you get, that had fonts, that had Ethernet connectivity, that had email, that had icon-based system, Windows, all of these elements, a mouse, a graphical user interface. These were all part of Xerox's machine. But Xerox viewed itself as a copier company. They didn't view themselves as a computer company. And so even though they developed this amazing system, because they only viewed themselves as a copier company, they only sold it as part of a document management system that cost $50,000 to get into as the base price. So nobody bought it. But you know what? Two guys, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, paid Xerox about $10 million in Apple stock to just walk through the R&D center where this computer had been developed and look at it and look at the technology there. They then took the ideas that Xerox had sitting right in front of them and changed the world by creating the first truly personal computer. They did it with technology that was already on the market, but they were able to look at that with a fresh set of eyes and see how it could change everything. And what I try to do in red teaming with this book is show companies how to do that themselves, how to do it to themselves, rather than wait for someone else to come and do it to them. Because right now, Daniel, in every industry in the world, and again, whether you're running a global corporation or a furniture store in Poughkeepsie, Illinois, you're living in fear of a disruptor emerging in your industry and eating your lunch, a new Uber, an Amazon. And rather than wait for that to happen to you, you can use the tools and the techniques that I learned from the military and intelligence agencies that I described in this book to do it to yourself first, to disrupt yourself and become one of the disruptors in your industry rather than wait to be disrupted.
Now, Bryce, it's as you start the book, you do talk about 9/11 and how did we miss the signals, things like that, when in fact we actually had plenty of, I guess, intelligence that really let us know, hey, something very big is about to go on here. There's no doubt that we know this, and it's funny how we always seem to know, gee whiz, there it is after the fact. Hindsight is 20/20, so to speak. But it's funny that to use the military, and I say this because I actually served in the United States Navy. And there is a lot of level of chain of command. It's like you really can't seem to do anything until you get a bunch of approval, and then you make a move, and by the time sometimes decisions seem to be made, it's already been way too late. How did the military come to, let's say in a way, create what red teaming is, the philosophy, that sort of a thing?
They did it because they got their nose bloodied. They got their nose bloodied by the insurgency in Iraq. And it forced them to realize just what you said, Daniel, was true, and to figure out a way to overcome that. So if you look back, beginning in the early 1990s, when we, at least at the time, we thought we had won the Cold War, maybe not so much now, but when we thought we'd won the Cold War, and we had these very easy one-sided victories in the Persian Gulf and in the Balkans, and that led our military planners and our intelligence agencies to believe, across the board, to believe that America had essentially become invincible. And the narrative that they told themselves in the Pentagon and in Langley and in the FBI headquarters was that our mastery of information and our technological superiority was sufficient to guarantee victory abroad and security at home for the foreseeable future. In other words, we could let our guard down a little bit because we were invincible. Well, on 9/11, we learned that we weren't. And then, in our response to 9/11, in the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, when we saw the victories that we won kind of evaporate before our eyes, we also learned how uninvincible we were. And so as a result, both the intelligence community and the Army both had a similar response to this. On September 12th, 2001, the CIA created the Red Cell, which is their version of a red team. And Director Tennant stood it up with the intention of providing that other set of eyes that you talked about, Daniel, of having somebody else look at our assumptions, look at the prevailing view in the CIA, and argue that maybe it wasn't true, to try to poke holes in it, to try to find fault in it. Even, not necessarily because it wasn't correct, but by kind of stress testing it, make sure it really was. And if it wasn't correct, then find out what was. So that's what the CIA did. In 2004, after the insurgency had really expanded in Iraq, and the U.S. Army had a similar reaction where they created a lessons learned team to try to figure out how to cut through that bureaucracy that you talked about, Daniel, and how to challenge their own thinking. And that's what led them to create this formal process known as red teaming. And they actually have set up red teams at the corps level, at the division level, even in some cases at the brigade level, to do just that, to basically have a group of analysts whose job it is to look at whatever the plan or strategy is and try to poke holes in it, to try to argue that the opposite is true. And that, when it's been allowed to work, and it's an important caveat because, unfortunately, politics interferes with these decisions, and it hasn't always been allowed to work, which is why we have ISIS now. But when it was allowed to work, like in 2007, the troop surge that got so much publicity was a product of this red team thinking. So at the time, President Bush made the decision that we needed to pull out of Iraq. But using red teaming analysis, General Petraeus said, okay, the best way to pull out of Iraq is to actually send more troops to Iraq. And using red teaming analysis, he was able to come up with a plan that said, let's send a whole bunch of troops all at once. Let's secure the country. Let's wipe out the insurgency. And then we can pull out. It won't look like another Vietnam where we're clinging to the helicopters on the last day. And Iraq will be secure, and we will have accomplished our objectives. And it worked initially. It worked very well. And even politicians who'd originally opposed the surge, like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, would later say that they thought it had been a success. But unfortunately, before General Petraeus's plan was allowed to kind of reach its final stage, Washington declared victory and pulled the rest of the troops out, for political reasons, and then everything fell apart again. But that's a good example of how red teaming works and how hard it is to keep it working, too.
Now, you bring up something very valuable for our listeners to pay attention to, and that is the idea of patting yourself on the back when you've had a success. And so often, and I'll actually use an industry that I was familiar with many years ago before I got into broadcasting, and that is the restaurant industry. We started out our restaurants, based on, for instance, there could be one individual that came up with a brilliant idea, really knew the industry about quality customer service, and so forth. And the next thing you know, they begin to repetitiously kind of recreate that win. But they don't realize that as years go by, people's change in tastes, for instance, they waver. People's change in the way they want to be served begins to waver. They want something different, new experiences. And I remember in one place that I was working, I was trying to suggest, look, people want to go out for a dining experience, and in some cases maybe even want to be slightly entertained. Not that you want the guy or the gal standing by your table bugging you the whole time, but they want to feel that there's something a little bit different. No, they don't want that kind of an experience. And slowly but surely, over the course of the next couple of years, they kept watching their business go down. And so what they started trying to do to get people back through the door is increasing the level of coupons and discounts they were giving people.
Yep.
And I said, this is ridiculous. You're actually buying customers to come in. Of course you're going to get these people short term because they're saving a bunch of money. But in the long term, you're giving them the same thing that caused you to do this in the first place. And it kept being argued with me, and I was thinking to myself, okay, look, you want to go ahead and rest on your laurels, be all for it. You know, it's funny because within 2 years after I left, I read in the newspaper this particular company, which grew to something like 10 stores from the Northwest down to the Southwest, declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And I said, you know, look, I was telling you the whole time, but apparently nobody would challenge the owner. You know, nobody would step up and say, you know, we're on the ground floor here. You should think about maybe doing this, you know, that sort of fresh set. Instead of sitting in your office, you know, resting on the fact that, yeah, you were successful coming out of a gate with a concept, but this is an ever-changing landscape here, and you chose not to do that. And, well, how's that Chapter 11 working for you?
Well, Daniel, you raise a very important point here, and that's that, you know, when you're that person, when you're that voice of reason, or the person with the new idea in an organization, and you just simply try to surface that through the you know, kind of regular channels, through the hierarchy, the problem with that is it becomes personal, and the leader takes it as an attack on their vision, or as a threat to what they've built. And the beauty of red teaming is it's a process. So if you make red teaming, if you take that food chain that you just talked about, that restaurant chain, if they had made red teaming part of their planning process, then at whatever cadence they had selected, there would be this critical review of the business strategy. There would be a discussion of how can we do what we're doing better. And then it's not personal. It's just another input for the leader to consider in an unthreatening way that doesn't challenge their leadership, but gives them that information. It's so powerful. You know, one of the things that I do when I work with companies that is just a little example, give your listeners a little taste of how red teaming can work, is we go into a company and we say, you know, my background is I used to be a financial journalist. So I say, you know, when I was working in newspapers, there were a lot of lies we told ourselves as the newspaper industry collapsed around us. We told ourselves, for instance, that people needed the service we provided, that they needed it, that even if they went away from it for a time, they would come back because it was like air. They couldn't survive without it. We told people, we told ourselves that people didn't want to read on an electronic device. They still wanted to have a paper they could fold under their arm and carry onto the subway.
I certainly also felt that way about books, you know, and if, you get yourself in a little bit of trouble on the Safeway, you got, you know, a book you can throw at somebody. Nobody's going to throw their cell phone, but, yeah, I see your point.
But these were lies we told ourselves. So I tell people this, and I say, now, so here's some lies that the newspaper industry told itself. I give people a 3.5 by 5 card, and I give everybody the same color pen. And I say, in block letters, I want you all to write down on this card one lie that your company tells itself. And then I collect them, and I read some of them. And I can tell you without fail, you should see the eyes of the CEO of that company when we read those cards, because they know what they're hearing is true. But it's stuff that they're not hearing in their day-to-day life, which is why you need a system like red teaming to surface those things. You know, one of the stories that I love from the military that I heard is there was a 4-star general who, when you get promoted, as you know, in the military, as an officer, you have a pinning on ceremony, right, where you get your new rank pinned on. And this general was saying that was relating the story that he was a 3-star general and he got his 4th star, which is the highest rank that you can have in today's Army. And another 4-star general was designated to pin his 4th star on. And as he pinned his 4th star on, he leaned over and whispered in his ear and said, "Congratulations. No one will ever tell you the truth again."
Wow.
And that's the challenge that we face as leaders, whether we're running a small store or whether we're running the U.S. Army. And so you need systems to help get at the truth that's out there, and that's what red teaming provides. You know, I want to say one other thing, Daniel, about your example, which I thought was so interesting. What you described with that restaurant chain, think about what's happening right now with Macy's. That is exactly what has happened at Macy's over the past decade. Macy's has been losing its business quarter after quarter to Amazon, to other online retailers. And what has their response been? More sales, more coupons, to the point that you walk into a Macy's now and everything is always on sale all the time. And yeah, that helps douse the fire a little bit, but guess what? They're still losing share every quarter, and now they're in deep, deep trouble. And fortunately, I mean, we'll see how it turns out, but fortunately, they just got a new CEO who, for the first time that I can think of, that I can remember, they have a CEO who's saying, okay, wait a second, maybe we need to rethink our whole business strategy. And instead of just having more sales and giving people more coupons, maybe we need to fundamentally change something about the way we sell clothing, by the way we sell things, because it's not working. And, you know, Bill Gates once said that success is the worst teacher. Success is a poor teacher. And it's so true, because when companies are successful, as you said, they think they've cracked the code. But let me give you another example. You know, most people don't remember this, but Polaroid was actually, at one point, the market leader in digital consumer cameras. They had the best-selling digital consumer camera on the market. And you know what they did? They looked at it and they said, these cameras are great. That, you know, they're selling well, but we only make, you know, 10 or 15% margin on these things, whereas our film business, we're making 70% margin. And, you know, if we get more successful, if we increase our share of you know, if we sell more digital cameras, that's just going to eat into our film sales. So let's pull the plug on this digital camera business and focus that money, instead of developing a better digital camera. Let's double down on our film business. Well, I mean, it's easy in retrospect to say those guys were colossally stupid. And indeed, you know, it cost them the company. It went bankrupt because of that decision. But those weren't stupid people. Daniel, those were people who had been so successful that their success blinded them to the weaknesses of their strategy. Nobody asked the simple question, well, if we stop our digital camera business, does that mean everyone else is too? If someone had just asked that simple question, obviously everyone in the room would have slapped their forehead and said, well, of course not. But people don't do that. And that's one of the things that red teaming is based on. You know, when the Army created red teaming, they went to all of the research that's been done over the past several decades by cognitive psychologists like the Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman and others, who've discovered that there's a whole array of biases and blind spots that all of us suffer from. No matter how smart we are, no matter how well educated we are, we still suffer from them. It's just the way our brain is wired. And one of those is loss aversion. And it's been proven in research studies time and time again that we are much more concerned about losing something we have than gaining something that could be 1,000 times better. It's just the way we're wired. And so if you don't have a system to kind of counter those biases, you're going to fall victim to them sooner or later.
No doubt about that's for sure. You know, I'm kind of curious now, is it possible to set up red teaming within an organization, or should people consider, for instance, outsourcing it?
There's different models of how you can use red teaming, and they all have their pluses and minuses. On one end of the spectrum, you know, you can do what the Army did, and if you're a large enough organization, and set up a standing red team inside your organization. Its entire job is to kind of act as that second set of eyes you talked about in the introduction. And that can be very effective, but that's also very expensive, and that's probably beyond the reach of even some of the largest corporations in these days of belt tightening. You know, at the other end of the spectrum, you can just use some of the tools and techniques that I describe in my book and just kind of do it yourself, and that will make your plans better, but it's not the same thing as having a second set of eyes. So in between those two extremes, there's a couple of other different models that can be very effective. One is that you can select someone in your organization and get them trained as a red teamer, and then they can kind of stand up an ad hoc red team from people within your company to look at big strategies and plans on an as-needed basis. Or you can hire an outside red team facilitator to come in and do the same thing. That's a lot of what I do. Is I go into companies and I simply lead the executives, lead the leaders of the company through red teaming exercises on their strategy or plan. All of these things can be effective, and all of them, like I say, have their different strengths and weaknesses. I talk in my book a lot about how to find the right type of red teaming, the right size of a red teaming engagement for your company.
Now, I also like what you talk about in your book when it comes to people evaluating whether they want to do this, and the idea of, let's say, hiring a consultant or a red team consultant or consultants to do this, and whether or not this is cost effective or not. You actually say, well, let's take a look at, how do you measure something like that? Give us an example of that.
Well, that's one of the biggest challenges of red teaming. As one of the colonels who put together the U.S. Army's red teaming program put it to me, how do you measure the value of no dogs barking? Because red teaming, if it works, saves you from yourself. So if red teaming works, the thing that bad things don't happen, and because they don't happen, there's nothing on the balance sheet that shows that they didn't happen. So that is one of the challenges that businesses have to think about as they consider red teaming is, this is not a system that you're going to red team your strategy and you're going to be able to say, well, red teaming saved us, 12% year over year. What red teaming may save you from is a blunder that puts you out of business, though.
Right.
And that's the point. So it is tough. It's tough to put a value on that. And if there's a challenge to selling red teaming, if you will, it's the fact that it's not something that directly correlates to a cost savings that people can see. Because if it's working, the things that it's saving you from are things that never happen. Mm-hmm. So how do you put a price on a new competitor never emerging to threaten you because you already figured out how to disrupt your own industry so no one else could do it? How do you put a price on not going through with a merger that would have been disastrous for your company because red teaming showed you that it would have been a huge problem? These are tough questions to answer. But what I tell people though is that larger companies spend a lot of money every year on consulting, and a lot of what they spend that money on is literally paying people to look at their watch and tell them what time it is. You know what I mean?
Right. They want
red
somebody
teaming,
to come in maybe with fresh eyes, but basically they seem like they want somebody to agree with what they're already doing.
And what red teaming is going to do is not agree with what you're doing. It's going to challenge you. It's like, if you have a knife and it's dull and you want to sharpen it, you can't sharpen it by rubbing it with a nice chamois cloth. You've got to take it and whack it against steel to sharpen it. So red teaming, the way I describe it, Daniel, is red teaming is like tough love for companies. That's really what it is. It's like tough love for companies. It makes you a little uncomfortable, but it also makes you a lot more successful. And to me, that trade-off is worth it.
Well, and what somebody should consider, especially in lieu of this discussion here as well, which of these two things would you rather be, right or effective?
Exactly.
A lot of times a lot of people want to be right. They want to find a way to be effective after the fact.
Well, and the thing is, Daniel, people ask this question, is red teaming for everyone? And I say, no, it's not. One of the first lessons they taught us in the Army is you can't red team in the fear bunker. You can't red team in an organization where the leader of the organization is just convinced that they're right and doesn't want to hear anybody else's opinion and has no desire to do better than they already are doing. Like that restaurant that you talked about, that restaurant chain that figured that they'd cracked the code, and so there was no need to try to even improve on what they were doing. Right. You can't red team in an organization like that. Mm-hmm. So my advice to companies like that, because they're out there, is don't red team. Right. Just sit back and wait and let your competitors red team you.
Yeah, there you go. That's even rougher than tough love.
Yeah, well,
and I was going to point out too.
That experience.
Right, and I was going to point out too what was crazy about the way they decided to resolve the problem. Lower price points on lunch and dinner and the coupons and so forth. Yeah, that was effective at bringing customers in, but those customers were also ones that were creating the most complaints, which had them comping a lot of stuff. So, you ended up spending more money on these people than they were actually worth. And in the end, it didn't work anyway. So
that's the problem. Is a lot of times the easy way out leads us right back in. And red teaming, one of the things that red teaming is most effective at exposing, Daniel, is the kind of unintended consequences that our plans and strategies have. So there's specific tools that I describe in the book that you can use on a plan or a strategy that will show you the kind of second and third order effects of what you're doing that most of us never think about. And these were hugely important for the U.S. military because that's a lot of how we got into trouble in Iraq. I'll give you just one example that they taught us about in our class. We have a bomb that goes off in the air and it just kind of shoots out a burst of carbon filaments that gently float down on the breeze, and they land on power lines, and they short them out. And we used it very effectively in Serbia during the Balkans Wars. We took out the Serbian power grid. It was very easy to do. We did it in a day, and nobody gets killed because it blows up in the air. But the problem is that Serbia is a small country in a temperate climate. And so even though the Serbian civilians were not terribly thrilled with the fact that they didn't have any electricity, it wasn't a life or death issue for most of them. Well, when we were planning the invasion of Iraq, we thought, boy, this sure worked great in Serbia. Let's do the same thing in Iraq. Let's short out their entire electric grid, and then, that'll really throw them for a loop. And it did. But it also took a country that's in the middle of the desert, in the middle of summer, and deprived it of air conditioning, refrigeration, and guess what? A country that has to pump all of its water from underground for the most part, with water even. And so literally, as soon as we did that, people in the military were going, oh, wait a second, maybe this wasn't the best thing to do. Because, the military teaches all of its officers about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what Maslow's hierarchy tells us is that people don't really care whether they live under a dictatorship or a democracy if they don't have running water and refrigeration. You've got to take care of people's basic needs first. And so in retrospect, it was pretty obvious that was a really bad decision. But it seemed like a really good decision at the time.
Absolutely. I know, there are a lot of wonderful examples you give in the book, and I think people could be encouraged to pick this up because this goes also beyond business. To me, it also goes with you being able to take a look at individual situations and ways that maybe you want to improve your life by challenging, for instance, your own biases and beliefs. I mean, after all, as I believe it was Einstein was quoted as saying, that you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that got you those problems in the first place. And you can see how this is something that can help you step outside of that and say, if you're willing to be brutally honest with yourself, and you most of all have made a commitment that you really know that you need to change because you would like things to be better in whatever area of your life that is, this book here is certainly something for people. And the book is called Red Teaming. Our guest today joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is Bryce Hoffman. Bryce, is there a website people can find out about your book and things like that?
Yeah, you can find out about my book at www.brycehoffman.com, all one word, BRYCEHOFFMAN.com. And you can find out more about red teaming at redteamthinking.com, all one word.
Very good. Bryce, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Great discussion.
Enjoyed talking with you, Daniel. Thank you.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more. Visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.